swinging doors, a piano playing in the corner, cowboys lined up at the bar, trading stories over glasses of whiskey. That's the saloon we know from the movies, a place of adventure, of high-stakes poker games and dramatic showdowns, where heroes and villains crossed paths and legends were born. But the real Wild West saloon was something else entirely. Behind those swinging doors lay a world of watered-down poison, rigged card games, and violence that rarely saw justice. A place where the floor told stories the movies never would, and where a single night could cost you everything. The saloon wasn't a backdrop for adventure, it was a test of survival. This is the truth about Wild West saloons. Fact 1, the whiskey could kill you. Let's start with what brought most men through those doors in the first place, the whiskey. In the movies, cowboys belly up to the bar and throw back shot after shot of smooth frontier bourbon. The reality was far more dangerous. Real whiskey was expensive. Shipping quality spirits to remote mining towns and cattle stations cost more than most saloon owners were willing to pay. So they made their own. Or rather, they made something they called whiskey. The base was usually raw alcohol, cheap, harsh, almost undrinkable on its own. So they added ingredients that would horrify anyone today. Burnt sugar for color, chewing tobacco for flavor, cayenne pepper to give it bite. Some added gunpowder, believing it gave the drink strength. Others used turpentine, creosote, even strychnine in small doses. The goal wasn't taste, it was the appearance of taste, and the ability to stretch a single barrel into dozens of bottles. They called it rot gut, tarantula juice, coffin varnish. The names weren't poetry, they were warnings. Men went blind from drinking bad whiskey. Others suffered permanent damage to their stomachs and livers. Some simply didn't wake up the next morning, their bodies unable to process the poison they'd paid good money for. And yet, the saloons kept pouring, and the men kept drinking, because after months on a cattle drive, after weeks in the mines, after days of dust and isolation, that burning sensation going down felt like being alive again, even if it was slowly killing them. Fact 2. The smell hit you before the doors closed, before a man ever tasted that whiskey, before he placed a bet or spoke a word. He experienced something else, the smell. We think of saloons as wooden buildings, rustic, simple, perhaps even charming in their frontier roughness. But close your eyes and imagine the truth. Dozens of men packed into a single room. Men who hadn't bathed in weeks, sometimes months. Cowboys who'd spent 30 days on a cattle drive, sleeping in the same clothes they wore in the saddle. Miners covered in dust and sweat from 12-hour shifts underground. There was no running water, no ventilation to speak of. The only fresh air came through those swinging doors, which did little to clear a room thick with the smell of unwashed bodies. And that was just the beginning. Tobacco smoke hung in the air like fog. Spittoons lined the floor, and most men missed more often than they hit. The smell of chewing tobacco, of stale beer, of whatever passed for food in the back room, it all mixed together. Kerosene lamps added their own acrid smell, so did the candles. On hot days, the wooden walls themselves seemed to sweat, releasing odors absorbed from years of use. Visitors from eastern cities wrote about it in letters home. The stench, they said, was overwhelming. Some couldn't make it past the doorway. But for the men who lived in this world, the men who worked the land and the mines and the cattle trails, the smell was simply part of the price of admission. A beer that might be more water than grain. A shot of whiskey that might blind you, and air so thick you could taste it. Welcome to the saloon. Fact 3. The floor told the real story. If you want to know what really happened in a Wild West saloon, don't look at the bar, look down. The floors of most saloons were covered in sawdust, inches of it in some places, and there was a reason for that. Sawdust absorbed things, spilled drinks, tobacco juice from the men who missed the spittoons, blood from the fights that broke out nightly, other fluids best not mentioned. At the end of each night, or sometimes each week, the sawdust would be swept out and replaced. But during business hours, it simply accumulated everything the saloon produced. Walking across the saloon floor meant walking through the evidence of every transaction, every argument, every moment of violence that space had witnessed. Some saloons tried to maintain standards. They'd sweep more frequently, replace the sawdust daily. But in boom towns where business never stopped, where miners and cowboys and gamblers rotated through in endless shifts, the floor was always telling its story. Old-timers spoke of saloons where the sawdust had turned dark from use, where the smell rising from the floor was almost worse than the smell of the men standing on it. In the finest establishments back east, floors were polished wood, kept clean by staff, a point of pride. In the Wild West, the floor was a living record of everything the saloon contained, every drop of rot gut, every spray of tobacco, every drop of blood from every broken nose and split lip. And every night, men would pull up chairs, sit down at card tables, and place their boots right into the middle of it. They had no other choice. Fact 4, the games were never fair. Gambling was the heartbeat of the Wild West saloon. Faro, poker, monte, dice games with names now forgotten. Men lined up to test their luck, believing that fortune might finally smile on them. But fortune had little to do with it. The house always won, not by chance, but by design. Faro was the most popular game in the West. On the surface, it seemed to offer decent odds. But dealers had perfected the art of manipulation. Marked cards, rigged dealing boxes, sleight of hand passed down from gambler to gambler like a secret trade. Poker offered different dangers. Professional gamblers drifted from town to town, sitting down at tables with cowboys and miners who'd never learned to spot a cheat. These professionals worked alone, or sometimes in teams, using signals to share information about each other's hands. A rancher who'd sold his herd might sit down with 6 months' wages in his pocket. By midnight, he might have nothing left but the clothes on his back, and complaining was dangerous. Accusing a man of cheating was an invitation to violence. Even if you were right, especially if you were right, you might not survive the accusation. Some cheaters were caught, some were beaten, a few were killed on the spot, their bodies dragged out back before the next hand was dealt. But for every cheat who faced justice, dozens more continued their work, night after night, town after town, taking everything from men who never saw it coming. The honest games did exist. Some dealers ran clean tables. Some saloons built their reputation on fair play. But a stranger walking into an unfamiliar saloon had no way of knowing. Was this game honest? Was that dealer trustworthy? Were the men at the table working together? The only safe assumption was that nothing was safe. Fact 5. The piano player saw everything in the corner of almost every saloon. Sat a man at a piano. We picture him as part of the atmosphere. Background music. A romantic detail that made the saloon feel complete. But the piano player occupied a unique position in that world. He saw everything. From his bench in the corner, he watched the fights break out. He watched the cheating at the card tables. He watched men drink themselves into oblivion, and watched them get dragged out when they couldn't pay. And through all of it, he kept playing. That was his job, to keep the music going no matter what happened around him. A gunshot across the room? Keep playing. A man bleeding on the floor? Keep playing. The sheriff dragging someone out in chains? Keep playing. The music was meant to maintain the illusion that everything was normal, that the saloon was a place of entertainment and relaxation, even when it clearly wasn't. Piano players learned to read rooms. They knew when trouble was brewing by the way men stood. by the tone of voices rising, by the sudden silences that preceded violence. Some learned to play louder during confrontations, hoping the music might calm tensions or at least cover the sounds of what was happening. Others simply kept their heads down and their fingers moving, understanding that drawing attention to themselves could make them targets. They were witnesses to everything, and they were paid to pretend they saw nothing. Night after night, song after song, watching the truth of the saloon unfold from the best seat in the house. Fact 6. Knockout drops were standard practice. Not every danger in the saloon came from a gun or a fist. Some came in a glass, knockout drops. What we might call a Mickey Finn today were a common tool in the seedier establishments of the Wild West. The practice was simple. A man would order a drink while he was distracted, or while the bartender had his back turned. Something would be slipped into his glass. Chloral hydrate was common, so were other sedatives available at the time. The doses varied, and that was part of the danger. Too little, and the mark might only feel drowsy. Too much, and he might never wake up. Once unconscious, the victim would be relieved of his money, his watch, his boots, anything of value. Then he'd be dragged out to the alley and left in the dirt. If he woke up the next morning with nothing but a headache and empty pockets, he was lucky. Some didn't wake up at all. The practice was so common that it spawned its own vocabulary. Getting slipped a drink, getting Mickey Finned, expressions that survive today. Born from the saloons of the frontier, travelers were warned about it. Don't drink alone. Don't take your eyes off your glass. Don't trust a friendly stranger who offers to buy you around. But after weeks on the trail, after finally reaching town with money in your pocket, caution was often the first thing to disappear, and the predators knew it. They waited for the cattle drives to arrive. They watched for the miners celebrating a big find. They identified the marks, and they made their move. By morning, another man would wake up in an alley, or wouldn't wake up at all, wondering what had happened to his fortune. Fact 7. Violence rarely met justice. Arguments in saloons turned violent with disturbing regularity. A dispute over cards, an insult taken too seriously, competition over the attention of a woman, debts unpaid, old grudges meeting new alcohol. The triggers varied. The results were often the same. But here's what the movies rarely show. When violence erupted in a Wild West saloon, justice was far from guaranteed. In many towns, law enforcement barely existed. A single sheriff might be responsible for an entire county, hundreds of square miles of territory. He couldn't be everywhere. He often wasn't anywhere nearby when trouble broke out, even when lawmen were present. The legal system was primitive at best. There were no forensic investigations, no careful collection of evidence. Witnesses were unreliable, either too drunk to remember clearly or too afraid to speak against dangerous men. A man could kill another in a saloon on Saturday night and be drinking in the same establishment Sunday afternoon. Self-defense was a broad concept on the frontier. If a man could claim he'd been threatened, if he could argue the other man reached for a weapon first, that was often enough to avoid consequences, and sometimes no justification was needed at all. Saloon owners wanted to keep the peace, but they also wanted to keep the customers. Reporting every fight to the sheriff was bad for business. Many incidents were simply handled quietly, the body removed, the blood covered with fresh sawdust, the piano player starting a new song. By the next morning, it was as if nothing had happened, until it happened again. Fact 8. The women who worked there. The saloon was largely a man's world, but women were there too, and their stories are often the most complex and the most overlooked. Some worked as entertainers, singers, dancers. They performed on small stages or simply moved through the crowd, adding an element of glamour to an otherwise rough environment. These women occupied a difficult position. They were expected to be friendly with the customers, to keep them drinking and spending, without crossing lines that could put them in danger. Others worked serving drinks. They'd move from table to table, taking orders, delivering glasses, enduring whatever comments or advances came their way. The pay was often tied to how much they could encourage customers to spend. The more a man drank, the more she earned. It created pressures that pushed many women into uncomfortable situations. And then there were the women who worked upstairs. Most large saloons had rooms on the second floor. What happened in those rooms was an open secret. It was income for the establishment. It was survival for the women involved. Some chose this work. In a world with few options for single women, where respectable employment paid pennies, the calculus was brutal but clear. Others had no choice at all. They'd been sold into the work, or trapped by debt, or simply had nowhere else to go. Life for these women was hard, and often short. Disease was common. Violence was a constant threat. The men who paid for their time often treated them as less than human. A few managed to save money, to buy their way out, to start new lives somewhere else. Most weren't so fortunate. Their names rarely appear in the history books. Their stories were considered unfit for polite society. But they were there, every night, part of the world the saloon created. And they deserve to be remembered. Fact 9. The saloon was the center of everything. Here's something the movies actually get right. The saloon wasn't just a bar, it was the center of community life. In towns that sprang up overnight around mines or railroad lines, there often wasn't time to build proper civic infrastructure. No town halls, no courthouses, no dedicated spaces for the business of running a community. So the saloon filled the gap. Need to hold an election? Clear out the card tables and set up a voting booth. Need to conduct a trial? The saloon becomes a courtroom. The bar becomes the judge's bench. The accused sits where poker players sat the night before. Need to hold a town meeting? Everyone gathers at the saloon. It's the only building large enough to hold them all. Funerals were held in saloons. So were weddings. Business deals were negotiated over whiskey. Land was bought and sold. Contracts were signed on tables still sticky from the night before. Doctors sometimes used saloons as makeshift hospitals. It was the only place with enough space and enough light to work on patients. Even religious services occasionally took place within those walls. Traveling preachers would set up where they could find an audience, and the saloon always had an audience. This created a strange duality. The saloon was a place of vice and violence, but it was also the closest thing many frontier towns had to a public square. The same room that saw brawls and gambling on Saturday might see a christening on Sunday. It was everything the community needed it to be, because it was often the only thing the community had. Fact 10. Few regulars live to old age. There's one final truth about the Wild West saloon that deserves attention. The men who frequented these places, the regulars who spent their nights drinking and gambling and fighting, most of them didn't live long lives. Not because of dramatic gunfights, not because of famous showdowns in the street, but because of everything the saloon represented. The alcohol was poison, and men drank it constantly. Liver failure, kidney damage. The slow deterioration that comes from years of consuming substances never meant for human consumption. The violence took its toll as well, not always fatally, but accumulated injuries, broken bones that never healed right, damage from dozens of fights. These added up over time. Disease spread easily in those close quarters. Tuberculosis, cholera, infections that antibiotics would easily treat today, but which were death sentences on the frontier. The lifestyle itself was brutal. Late nights, poor nutrition, constant exposure to the elements during the day, followed by cramped and smoky rooms at night. A man might survive the cattle drive. He might survive the mining accident. He might survive the card game gone wrong. but surviving the saloon, night after night, year after year, that was something else entirely. The old cowboys, the ones who lived long enough to tell their stories. They often spoke of the men who didn't make it, friends who faded away, partners who simply stopped showing up one day, the regulars whose faces disappeared from the bar, replaced by new faces that would soon disappear as well. The saloon didn't kill quickly, it killed slowly, steadily, one glass at a time, one fight at a time, one night at a time, until there was nothing left to take. The Wild West Saloon was never what the movies made it seem. It wasn't a place of glamour or adventure. It wasn't where heroes proved their courage or legends were born. It was a place of survival, of desperate men seeking escape from desperate lives, of predators waiting for prey, of women with few choices making the best of impossible situations. The swinging doors were real. The piano music was real. The whiskey, such as it was real. But so was the poison in the glass, the filth on the floor, the violence that rarely saw justice, the lives cut short by everything those walls contained. And yet, men kept coming, because after months of isolation, after back-breaking work and constant danger, the saloon offered something nothing else could: noise, company, the illusion at least of civilization, a place to spend your money, to test your luck, to feel, for a few hours, like you were part of something larger than the endless struggle to survive. That was the real Wild West Saloon, not a backdrop for legend, a mirror of the world that created it. If history like this speaks to you, subscribe. There are more stories to tell, more truths to uncover, more legends to set straight. The real West is waiting. Until next time.